Everybody knows the big one, the asteroid, 66 million years ago that ended the dinosaurs. It's the most famous catastrophe in the history of the planet, and rightly so. And people who go a little deeper know about the truly big one, the Great Dying, at the end of the Permian, the closest life ever came to being wiped out completely. These are the celebrity apocalypses. They get the documentaries, the movies, the headlines. But here's something that surprises even a lot of people who love this stuff. Scientists count 5 great mass extinctions in the history of complex life, the Big Five. And there's a growing argument among researchers that we've been miscounting, that there's a 6th, a catastrophe so severe it belongs in that elite terrible club, one that wiped out half the life in the ocean and toppled the rulers of the land. And yet almost nobody outside of paleontology has ever heard its name. It happened around 260 million years ago. It has an awkward, forgettable name, and it was, by any reasonable measure, one of the worst things that ever happened to life on Earth. Today, let me tell you about the worst extinction you've never heard of, the Capitanian. Now, the first thing you need to understand is why you've never heard of it, because the reason is genuinely interesting, and it's most of the story. This extinction had the worst possible luck in terms of timing and location. It happened during the Permian period, and it happened only about 8 million years before the Great Dying, the most catastrophic extinction of all time. Think about what that means. Imagine a disaster so enormous it kills half the life in the sea. Now imagine that in the grand timeline of Earth, just a moment later, an even bigger disaster happens right next door, one so overwhelming that it erases nearly everything. For a long time, geologists looking at the rock record could see there was devastation in this stretch of the Permian, but the two events were so close together and the Great Dying was so much more famous and dramatic that the earlier one basically got absorbed into it, swallowed up. Scientists assumed the damage was all part of the same long drawn-out end Permian catastrophe. It wasn't until 1994, which in the grand scheme of science is yesterday, that researchers first recognized the Capitanian as a genuinely separate, distinct mass extinction event in its own right. It had been hiding in the shadow of its more famous successor for as long as we'd been studying these rocks. So it's not that this extinction wasn't bad enough to notice, it's that it had the misfortune of happening right before the single worst catastrophe in Earth's history, which stole all its thunder. It's the opening act nobody remembers because the headliner blew the roof off. But make no mistake, this opening act was devastating. So let me take you to the world it destroyed, because it was a strange and alien one. The Capitanian falls in the middle Permian, a time long before the dinosaurs. They wouldn't evolve for tens of millions of years yet. All the land on Earth was fused into the great supercontinent Pangaea, and life, both in the sea and on land, had recovered from earlier crises and was flourishing in genuinely bizarre forms. The oceans were full of life built on a different template than today's. Vast reefs, but not coral reefs as we know them. They were built by sponges and other now vanished organisms. The seas teemed with brachiopods, with coiled-shelled ammonoids, with strange single-celled giants called fusulinids, and with enormous bivalves. It was a rich, productive, thriving marine world. And on land, the rulers were some of the strangest animals ever to live, the dinocephalians. The name means terrible head, and they earned it. These were big, bulky, primitive relatives of mammals, our own distant cousins, part of the lineage that would eventually lead to us. And some of them were massive, among the largest land animals of their day. They had thick, heavy skulls, and many sported bizarre bony bosses and knobs on their heads, which they likely used to headbutt each other in contests of strength. They came as fearsome predators with huge teeth and as lumbering plant eaters. And they were spectacularly successful. So successful that we find their fossils spread across the entire globe, from Russia to South Africa to Brazil to China. They were, for their moment, the dominant large animals on the planet. And then, around 260 million years ago, this whole world came apart. In the oceans, the toll was staggering. Estimates suggest the Capitanian wiped out something like half of all marine genera, half the broad groups of animals living in the sea. The great sponge and algal reefs of the tropics collapsed almost entirely. Reef ecosystems are always among the first and hardest hit in these crises, and here they were devastated. The giant fusulinids were decimated. The huge bivalves, the ammonoids, the brachiopods, group after group suffered catastrophic losses. The tropical shallow seas, which had been among the richest habitats on Earth, were gutted. And on land, the terrible-headed rulers fell. The dinocephalians, those dominant, globe-spanning, head-butting mammal relatives, were essentially wiped out by the Capitanian. An entire dynasty of the largest land animals on the planet, one of the great success stories of the Permian, brought down in this event. Gone. It's one of the clearest signals that this was a true global land and sea catastrophe, not some minor regional blip. When you erase the dominant land animals across the whole world, that is a mass extinction by any definition. So what did it? What could kill half the ocean and topple the rulers of the land? And here the story becomes familiar, because the prime suspect is the same villain behind the great dying that would follow, and behind so many of Earth's catastrophes: volcanoes. Specifically, a massive outpouring of lava called the Emeishan Traps. This was a large igneous province, one of those colossal volcanic events where, over hundreds of thousands of years, staggering volumes of lava erupt through the crust and flood across the landscape. The Emeishan eruptions happened in what is now southwestern China, and they left behind a vast formation of volcanic rock that still covers a huge area today. And crucially, the timing of these eruptions lines up with the extinction. That's the smoking gun researchers keep pointing to, the coincidence of the volcanism and the die-off. And the killing mechanism was the same deadly chain we've seen before. These eruptions pumped enormous quantities of gases into the atmosphere, carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide. The sulfur may have caused bursts of short-term cooling, and there's genuine evidence that a sharp cooling pulse was involved in the marine losses. But the carbon dioxide drove longer-term warming and, critically, poisoned the oceans. Because when you warm the seas and change their chemistry, you rob them of oxygen. And recent studies, including work from rocks in Arctic Canada, have found the fingerprints of widespread ocean anoxia, water starved of oxygen, right at the extinction level. Marine animals, in effect, suffocated across vast stretches of the sea, while the reefs dissolved and the climate lurched. Volcanic gas, climate chaos, and a suffocating ocean. The same brutal recipe that would, 8 million years later, be turned up to its maximum setting in the Great Dying. And that connection points to what might be the most important reason this forgotten extinction actually matters, beyond just correcting the record. Because some scientists think the Capitanian and the Great Dying weren't entirely unrelated. The idea is that the Capitanian may have weakened the world's ecosystems, knocked them down, stripped out their diversity, left them fragile and depleted. so that when the even greater catastrophe of the end Permian arrived a few million years later, life was already reeling, already vulnerable, and had far less resilience to withstand the second fatal blow. In this view, the Capitanian was the first punch in a devastating 1-2 combination. It softened the planet up for the knockout. If that's right, then this obscure, forgotten extinction may have been a crucial part of why the Great Dying was able to be so uniquely, apocalyptically severe. The famous catastrophe might not have been quite so catastrophic if this forgotten one hadn't come first. And that's really why it deserves to be remembered, why there's a serious, ongoing push among researchers to formally promote it, to make the Big Five into a Big Six. Because a mass extinction that kills half the ocean, wipes out the rulers of the land, and possibly sets the stage for the worst catastrophe in the history of life, is not a footnote. It's a main event that history simply forgot to write down. So what's the lesson in all of this? For me, it's a humbling one about how we remember the past, and it's twofold. First, that our attention is drawn to the biggest, the most dramatic, the most famous, and in the process, we miss things that are, by any objective measure, enormous. An extinction that would be a defining, terrifying chapter in the story of any other stretch of time gets forgotten simply because something even worse happened nearby. History has a spotlight, and the spotlight is narrow. And second, the deeper lesson, the one this channel keeps coming back to, the mechanism that drove the Capitanian is the same one behind so many of these crises. A large, relatively rapid injection of carbon and volcanic gas into the atmosphere and oceans, driving warming, cooling, and a catastrophic loss of oxygen in the seas. Again and again, when the Earth's carbon system gets violently disturbed, life pays a staggering price. The Capitanian is one more data point in that grim, repeating pattern. A forgotten one, but no less real for being forgotten. The world has ended more times than most people know, and some of those endings are so completely overshadowed that they've slipped out of our collective memory entirely. The Capitanian killed half the ocean 260 million years ago, and almost no one has ever heard its name. But the rocks remember. They always do. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep looking up.